The rope bit into her skin, digging deep into the soft flesh of her wrists until it burned like fire. With every tug, with every harsh pull forward, she stumbled, her bare feet scraping against the uneven stones of the village street. Dust rose with her fall, coating her in the earth of the place she had once called home, a place that now turned its back on her. The sun hung heavy above, casting its merciless heat on her already bruised body, and yet in her eyes burned a fire that no rope, no whip of humiliation, no public scorn could dim. They wanted her broken, they wanted her to bow, but she walked as one who had already endured storms greater than the jeering voices that filled the air around her. The mob dragged her with no mercy, their hands cruel and eager, their voices filled with venomous laughter that spilled across the street. "Look at her," one of them shouted. "The cursed one. The one who dares to defy." Their laughter roared, growing louder as more villagers emerged from their homes to witness the scene. Old men leaned on their staffs, their faces carved with the lines of silence, unwilling to intervene, unwilling to defend her though their eyes carried shadows of pity. Women clutched their children tightly, whispering warnings for them to look away, and yet the children stared, their wide eyes drinking in the cruelty of adults, learning without words how fear could silence even the righteous. She stumbled again, her knees hitting the sharp stones. A gasp rose from the crowd, for blood now streaked down her shin, crimson against the pale dust. But she did not cry out. She did not plead. She pushed herself up with slow, deliberate force, her wrists still bound, her shoulders hunched from the strain, and her head lifting ever so slightly, her eyes catching the light of the sun. In them was no shame, no brokenness, only the unyielding spark of someone who refused to be erased. That fire unsettled them. Those dragging her exchanged uneasy glances, for though her body bent under their cruelty, her spirit would not bend. The silence of the crowd pressed heavily against the laughter of her captors. A silence that was not ignorance but fear. They had seen what happened to those who resisted, those who dared speak when the powerful demanded obedience. They had seen houses burned, families scattered, graves dug in the dark of night. So they swallowed their words, their pity turning to ash in their throats, their compassion buried beneath trembling fear. Still, some shifted uneasily, their hands clenching into fists at their sides, their eyes darting between the girl and the captors. They wished to act, to cry out, to shield her, but the weight of survival pressed them into stillness. The rope pulled again, jerking her forward. She stumbled, nearly fell, but steadied herself on her feet, the rope biting deeper. Her captors sneered, mocking her defiance. "Why do you stare so boldly, girl?" one hissed, pressing her shoulder down with unnecessary force. "You should be on your knees, begging." But she only held his gaze, her lips pressing into a line, refusing him the satisfaction of a reply. Her silence was louder than any scream, and it pierced the jeers, gnawed at the laughter, made the crowd's silence feel heavier. Dust clung to her face, mixed with sweat and blood, but her eyes gleamed like embers in the twilight. She looked at the people gathered, at the women clutching children, at the men who turned away, at the elders who dared not speak, and her gaze was not one of plea but of challenge. It was as if she told them without words that they too were bound, though no rope wrapped their wrists. They too had been dragged, not through the streets, but through silence, through fear, through submission. And that realization stung. For in watching her endure without breaking, they saw the reflection of their own chains. Each stone beneath her feet seemed to sharpen as she walked, cutting into her skin, leaving streaks of red behind her as if marking a path of pain. And yet, the sound of her steps grew steady, rhythmic, a drumbeat echoing through the silence of the crowd. It was not just her body moving, it was her spirit, demanding to be remembered. Some in the crowd shifted again, a mother covering her child's eyes, a boy biting his lip as though fighting the urge to cry out. But still no one moved. The captors, emboldened by the lack of resistance from the crowd, grew harsher in their cruelty. One of them spat at her. Another raised his hand, striking her across the cheek, the sound sharp in the air. She staggered but did not fall. The sting burned her skin, but she only lifted her head higher, her hair falling in dusty strands across her face. Her tormentors cursed her resilience. They wanted her sobbing, screaming, crawling, but she gave them none of it. In her defiance, she stole their triumph. And so the humiliation that was meant to break her became something else. It became a mirror. A mirror to the villagers who watched in silence, forcing them to question the price of their fear. A mirror to her captors, who felt unease creep into their bones as they dragged a body that refused to surrender. And most of all, it became a torch. For though the rope cut her wrists and the stones cut her feet, It was her fire, her gaze, her unbroken will that burned brightest, searing itself into the memory of all who witnessed it. In that long walk through dust and blood, through silence and laughter, she became more than a victim. She became the embodiment of resistance itself. And even as she was dragged to her unknown fate, the people knew, though they dared not speak, that the girl bound in ropes was freer than any of them. Continue with the second outline now? The murmur of voices thickened like smoke in the air as more villagers spilled into the open space, drawn by the commotion. From the narrow paths between the mud-walled huts, men and women emerged, some curious, others unwilling yet unable to turn away. The sound of sandals scraping against the earth mingled with the faint jingling of ornaments and the clatter of clay pots hastily set aside. Whispers traveled quickly, bouncing from mouth to mouth, carrying judgment, confusion, and fragments of half-known stories. Some spoke with sharp tongues, feeding on the humiliation of the girl, while others lowered their gazes, hearts trembling though their lips dared not speak in her defense. Children clung to their mother's wraps, their wide, uncomprehending eyes fixed on the scene before them. A boy tugged at his mother's arm, asking why the girl's hands were bound, why her face was smeared with dust, why no one was helping her. The mother hushed him, pressing her palm firmly over his small mouth, fearing that even innocence could become dangerous if overheard. Another child whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear, questioning why laughter surrounded cruelty, but his father yanked him backward, shaking his head with a warning so heavy that it silenced not just the child but the neighbors who overheard. The questions hung unanswered, forming a painful echo in the minds of those who still possessed compassion. Amid the growing crowd, a group of young men jostled each other, their voices raised with mocking cheer, shouting cruel jokes and spitting words that stung deeper than stones. They exaggerated her stumble, pointing and laughing, making her pain into their spectacle. Yet behind them, an old woman turned her face away, her wrinkled hands trembling as she gripped her cane. Her silence was not consent but fear. Her own memory carried scars of a time when speaking against injustice brought only ruin. The elders sat beneath the shade of a large tree, their expressions carved in stone. They neither spoke nor shifted, their silence stretching heavier than the noise around them. Some villagers glanced in their direction, waiting for even a murmur of wisdom, a gesture that might break the spell of cruelty. But the elders' stillness was a wall. It was as though their silence was a verdict, or perhaps a shield against their own guilt. No one could tell if they were complicit or simply powerless. A young woman in the crowd clutched at her chest, her breath shallow. She wanted to step forward, to shout, to demand they stop, but the weight of the villagers' eyes pressed her down. She remembered what had happened to those who interfered before, remembered the whispered threats and the unspoken consequences. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, she joined the others in silence, her tears burning trails down her face. The men holding the rope that bound the girl paused, glancing around with pride in their cruelty, as if feeding on the crowd's divided reaction. They smirked when they saw those who cheered and sneered at those who turned away. Each tug of the rope was not just against the girl's wrists but against the conscience of every witness. The crowd had become an audience, unwilling participants in a cruel performance. As the sun climbed higher, its heat pressing on every back, the whispers thickened. Some spoke of curses, others of justice, others of fear that to show pity was to invite the same fate. The crowd's murmurs were a storm without lightning, restless but without release. And in that storm, the girl stood like a stone in a river, her head unbowed though the current of voices pushed against her. She did not speak, yet her silence screamed louder than any words could. In the distance, a drumbeat began, faint but deliberate, a signal that traveled through the air and settled in the hearts of all who listened. It called more villagers to gather, swelling the crowd until it was no longer just a group but the whole village, each person forced to witness, to choose whether to turn their eyes or to face what was unfolding. The weight of the gathering pressed upon the girl, but it also pressed upon the villagers themselves, reminding each of them that silence was not neutrality, it was complicity. And still the elders did not move. The crowd thickened, the whispers grew, the children still asked their innocent questions and the girl, bound and bruised, remained unbroken. The gathering was no longer about her alone. It had become a mirror showing every soul who they truly were in that moment. Exactly to 900? Her steps faltered, yet she refused to stumble. Each jagged stone cut into the soft flesh of her soles, painting the earth with small streaks of red. The rope around her wrists tightened with every tug, dragging her forward, but it was the ground itself that seemed to notice her pain. The villagers watching whispered of the trail she left, drops of blood that did not simply soak into the dirt, but glistened unnaturally, as though the earth drank eagerly from her suffering. Children peered from behind their mother's skirts, wide-eyed and trembling, for they swore the stones shifted when her feet touched them. A few elders muttered that the land itself was restless, that it groaned beneath the weight of this injustice. The girl herself felt it too. The air grew heavier, and the ground vibrated faintly beneath her toes, as though some hidden force deep within the soil stirred awake. But still the men dragging her laughed. They shouted curses, spat at her, and pulled harder, determined to break her spirit. When she stumbled onto a particularly sharp stone, a gasp tore from her lips, but she bit it back quickly, refusing to give them satisfaction. Her eyes lifted, not to the men, not to the crowd, but to the sky, as though appealing to something beyond human reach. The murmurs of the earth grew louder. The stones did not lie still anymore. Villagers near the front swore they heard a faint hum, low and ancient, rolling through the dirt roads beneath their feet. Some shuffled uneasily, their cheers fading into uneasy silence. Was it the weight of guilt pressing into their ears, or was the land itself protesting the cruelty unfolding upon it? With every drop of blood she left behind, the stones beneath her began to glisten faintly in the sunlight, shimmering as though touched by dew though the day was dry. A boy bent down, picking up one of the stones after she passed. His eyes widened, warmth pulsed within it, like the faint beat of a heart. His mother snatched it away and threw it aside quickly, whispering warnings of omens, but the boy never forgot the feel. The girl's pain grew, her breath shallow, but she walked as though the stones carried her now. Where once they cut, they seemed to lift. Where once they tore her skin, they steadied her steps. And as she advanced through the village street, the whispers grew, first from the people, then from the very ground. The earth itself seemed to murmur her name. Some said it was the echo of her spirit refusing to break. Others swore it was the ancestors rising from their slumber beneath the soil. Whatever it was, those who mocked her earlier now found their voices fading, their laughter drying on their tongues. The stones beneath her feet no longer seemed ordinary. They had become something more, witnesses, protectors, and perhaps even weapons yet to awaken. She walked on, bleeding yet unbroken. And though her tormentors tugged her forward, none could shake the feeling that it was not they who dragged her. It was the stones that carried her, step by step, toward a reckoning. The rope dug into her wrists, coarse and merciless, biting into her skin with each tug. At the other end, swaggering with the arrogance of one who had never tasted consequence, strode the chief's son. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and adorned in ornaments he had not earned, bronze rings clinking at his wrists, a lion's tooth dangling from a cord at his neck, feathers swaying atop his head as though he were a warrior. Yet those who watched him knew the truth. His hands had never known the weight of labor, his feet had never marched the long hunts, and his victories came not from skill, but from the shadow of his father's name. He grinned as the rope strained, pulling the girl forward like she were not a child of flesh but an animal bound for slaughter. "Look at her," he jeered, his voice carrying through the still air. "The cursed one bleeds for the earth. Let her blood be her offering." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some dared to chuckle, their laughter shallow, brittle. Others bowed their heads, unwilling to meet the girl's eyes, for they were mirrors of their own cowardice. The children, too young to understand the politics of cruelty, stared with wide, questioning eyes. Yet none dared challenge him, for he was the chief's heir, and his word carried the echo of authority. He yanked the rope suddenly, sending the girl stumbling to her knees. The stones cut deeper, her blood dripping into the cracks like seeds planted in secret soil. She winced, yet made no sound, her silence sharper than any scream. It enraged him. "Raise your voice, cursed one," he taunted, stepping closer, his shadow falling across her. "Cry out, beg, let the people hear you wail. Show them you are weaker than we say." But she lifted her gaze instead, her eyes meeting his with a stillness that unsettled even those who watched. In them was no fear, no plea, only an unbroken calm, as if she bore knowledge that he did not. For a flicker of a moment, his smile faltered. Still, arrogance was a shield he wore too proudly. He raised his voice higher, turning to the crowd. "Her silence means nothing. She thinks herself strong, but what is strength when her life lies in my hands? When I pull she falls. When I command she obeys. This is the measure of power." The villagers murmured among themselves. Some nodded, eager to appear loyal to the chief's bloodline. Yet the elders, seated in silence, did not move. Their eyes were heavy with the weight of memory, as if they had seen arrogance such as his before, and knew too well how it ended. He lifted the rope higher, forcing the girl to her feet, jerking her arms until her shoulders ached. He paraded her before the people, chest puffed, chin raised, his every step declaring victory. Today I strip her of dignity. Tomorrow she will be nothing but a shadow. Let all who think themselves strong remember, no one defies me. But even as he spoke, small signs betrayed him. The rope trembled faintly in his hands, though he gripped it tight. A buzzing hum seemed to rise from the stones beneath their feet, too faint for most to notice, but enough to make him glance down uneasily. His arrogance forced him to ignore it, yet the girl felt it, the stirrings of the earth, restless under the injustice. One of the villagers, an old woman with hair like drifting ash, muttered under her breath. The boy pulls a rope, but it binds not the girl, it binds him. Her words were soft, nearly lost in the noise, but those closest to her heard and shivered. The chief's son barked at the silence of the crowd, mistaking their unease for doubt. Do not let her eyes fool you. She is nothing. She is cursed. She has no power. I am the one who leads, the one who commands. Without me she is dust. He spat at the ground near her feet. And dust she shall remain. Yet as he pulled her forward again, the rope tightened strangely as if resisting his strength. His hand ached where the fibers dug into his palm. He masked the discomfort with more laughter, louder, harsher, but the girl saw it, the slight twitch at his jaw, the strain in his grip. She stumbled forward, not from his force but because she allowed it. She moved as though humoring him, each step her own, her silence deliberate. He mistook her endurance for submission, failing to see that with every drop of blood, with every quiet step, she was writing a story larger than his mockery. And though he stood tall, adorned, and cheered by those too frightened to oppose him, there was a fragility to his power. For all his boasting, he was still only a man clutching a rope, desperate to convince the world that his cruelty meant control. But the rope burned hotter in his hands now, the fibers cutting deeper, as if the earth itself had grown weary of him. The girl's calm eyes never left his face, and though she spoke no words, the silence between them thundered with a promise. His arrogance would not endure. And in the uneasy air, the villagers felt it too. Some would later swear the rope looked alive, pulsing faintly like a vein. Others claimed the stones shifted minutely, grinding against one another as though sharpening themselves. The chief's son laughed on, blind to the signs, basking in the illusion of triumph. But his laughter rang hollow, swallowed by a silence that grew heavier with each step. The rope bites into her wrists, raw and unforgiving, its fibers burning her skin with every tug. Dust clings to her lashes, coating her face in a thin veil of earth, but her eyes remain open, two unblinking flames fixed upon the world around her. She is dragged forward, her body stumbling, her bare feet scraping against the stones that seem to drink her blood. Yet through it all she does not utter a sound. Not a scream, not a whimper, not even a gasp of pain. Her silence is not weakness. It is defiance. The villagers, gathered in tense clusters along the dirt path, murmur among themselves. They expect cries, expect her voice to shatter under the cruelty of the torment. But none comes. Instead, her silence falls over them like a shadow, heavier than any cry of agony could ever be. Mothers clutch their children closer. Old men, their backs bent with age, shake their heads slowly as if sensing something they dare not name. Even the young, who had joined the march out of curiosity, begin to glance at one another uneasily. Still the chief's son sneers. He pulls the rope harder, as though the silence itself is an insult he must crush. "Speak, girl," he taunts, his voice loud and cutting through the murmurs. "Cry for your mother. Beg for your life. Let them all hear how weak you are." But her lips do not part. Instead, her gaze drifts over the faces in the crowd. She meets the eyes of women who had once turned away from her at the well, ashamed of her ragged clothes. She meets the eyes of men who laughed when she walked barefoot through the market. And in that silence, her eyes speak louder than any voice could. You mocked me, you despised me, but still I stand. You thought I was nothing, yet here I am, unbroken. For a moment, some cannot bear her gaze. They lower their heads, the weight of unspoken guilt pressing into their chests. Others glare harder, masking fear with anger. But none can deny the truth burning in her silence, that dignity cannot be stripped away by ropes or stones, nor can strength be measured in noise. A sudden rock flies from the crowd, striking her shoulder. She stumbles, the pain searing, but still no sound escapes her lips. The silence deepens. Even the birds overhead seem to pause their song, as if the sky itself waits for her to cry out. She does not. Instead, she steadies her breath and keeps walking, her body bloodied but her spirit untouchable. The women in the crowd exchange hushed whispers. Some say she must be possessed by spirits, others claim she carries a curse, for no ordinary girl could withstand such torment without a cry. But there are a few, very few, who see something else: courage. A courage they themselves have buried deep, too afraid to let it breathe in a world that silences them at every turn. Her silence spreads like fire through dry grass, seeping into the hearts of those who watch. The chief's son feels it too, though he would never admit it. Each moment she remains wordless, his pride gnaws at him. His mocking voice grows harsher, more desperate, as though he must drown out the truth she carries. "You think you are strong?" he spits, jerking the rope violently. "You are nothing. Nothing but dirt beneath my feet." Still she does not scream. Instead, she lifts her head, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet defiance. And in that look lies a message so sharp it cuts deeper than any blade. You may drag me, but you cannot own me. You may try to break me, but I am not yours to break. The crowd feels the shift. The silence is no longer emptiness, it is resistance. It is a weapon. Every step she takes without a cry becomes a blow against those who seek to shame her. Every breath she draws without begging becomes a victory. Children clutch tighter to their mother's skirts, watching her with wide, unblinking eyes. They will remember this. They will remember the girl who endured in silence, the girl whose strength did not roar but whispered, steady and unyielding. And one day, when they are older, her silence will echo in their choices, in the way they resist the cruelty of their own world. The chief's son cannot stand it. His mockery falters. He pulls the rope harder, dragging her through sharper stones, trying to force her into the noise he craves. But still she gives him nothing. No scream. No tears he can claim as his victory. And so it is he who begins to look smaller. The crowd sees it, the shift of power. He holds the rope, but he does not hold her. His laughter rings hollow now, brittle as dry reeds snapping underfoot. The silence has become hers, and within it lies an unshakable truth. Dignity cannot be chained. As the sun dips lower, painting the earth in gold and shadow, she continues to walk. Blood stains her feet, dust coats her hair, but her spirit shines clearer than ever. And though no sound escapes her, her silence speaks volumes, an unspoken cry of defiance that trembles in every heart. She may be dragged, but she will not be broken. And in that truth she becomes more than a victim. She becomes a mirror, reflecting the cowardice of those who torment her and the quiet strength buried in those who watch. Her silence is not absence. It is presence. It is power. It is the sound of a soul refusing to surrender. The rope bit into her wrists, her feet raw from being dragged along the dirt path. Dust clung to her face, and blood streaked her ankles where the stones had already cut her skin. But still her silence remained unbroken. The tormentors laughed louder with each step, thinking her quiet was a sign of surrender. They did not see what she felt deep within her bones, the ground humming faintly as if something ancient had been awakened. The first sign was so subtle that none but she noticed it. A pebble shifted, rolling from one side of the path to the other, though no foot had touched it. She turned her head slightly, her eyes catching the movement. Her lips curved faintly, almost invisible, as if she alone understood the secret. The earth was listening. Another stone trembled. This time, one of the tormentors accidentally kicked it aside and cursed, blaming his own clumsiness. But as they marched forward, the tremors grew bolder. Pebbles rolled into the path from every direction, as though drawn toward her blood that had dripped into the dust. Small streaks of crimson stained the soil, and where each drop landed, the ground shivered. The chief's son, arrogant and blind, laughed even louder. "Look how even the ground recoils from her," he shouted, tugging the rope to make her stumble. The crowd jeered with him, their cruelty feeding on his scorn. Yet behind them, unnoticed, a stone no bigger than a fist rolled uphill against the slope. A child in the crowd gasped and pointed, but his mother clutched his hand and shook her head, whispering for silence. Fear had already brushed against her heart. With every step forward, the sound grew, low groans, like ancient beasts buried beneath the earth stretching in their sleep. Some of the tormentors shifted uneasily but dared not speak. The chief's son turned to mock them, calling them cowards. He yanked harder at the rope, dragging the girl through another patch of stones. Her skin tore, blood soaking into the earth. And then it began. The ground beneath her seemed to breathe. A cluster of rocks shuddered, lifting slightly before falling again. Another stone rolled directly into the path of a tormentor, tripping him face first into the dirt. The others burst into laughter, thinking it nothing but clumsiness. But the girl raised her head, her eyes glowing with an unspoken knowing. It was no accident. The tormentors continued forward, oblivious to the mounting signs. A larger stone groaned, its weight shifting as though pushed from within. Dust rose in faint spirals, circling her bleeding feet. With every drop of her blood, the earth's stirring grew stronger. The girl's silence was no longer just defiance, it was communion. She did not need to speak. The land spoke for her. By now, the villagers following behind had begun to whisper. Some clutched their charms, muttering prayers to ward off evil. Others glanced at the girl with fear, wondering if the spirits had claimed her as their vessel. Still, the tormentors mocked, their laughter carrying through the air, even as the ground beneath them betrayed a faint, steady pulse. The chief's son dragged her through a patch of loose rocks, grinning when her knees scraped open. But this time the earth retaliated. A stone the size of a man's head lifted itself and rolled downhill, slamming into his shin. He stumbled, his laughter breaking into a cry of pain. His men helped him up, but his pride forced him to laugh again, spitting at the ground as if to show dominance. The girl watched quietly. Her eyes glimmered with something terrifyingly calm. She did not gloat, she did not smirk, but the power in her gaze made even the bravest of the tormentors shift uneasily. The stones continued to stir. Pebbles rolled into circles, forming strange patterns around her bloodstains. Larger rocks tilted and groaned, scraping against each other as though whispering secrets in a language older than men. The sound grew louder, a grinding chorus that only the guilty seemed deaf to. By the time they reached the edge of the village square, the earth's movement could no longer be denied. Dust clouds swirled without wind, and rocks rattled together like drums. The villagers dared not speak, their fear choking them silent. The tormentors tried to laugh, but their voices cracked. Only the chief's son still boasted, though his eyes darted nervously at the stones gathering around the girl's path. And then, when her blood dripped one last time onto the soil, a deep, thunderous crack split the silence. The ground itself shifted beneath their feet, sending shivers through their bones. The stones were no longer stirring. They were waking. The first cry broke the rhythm of their laughter. It was sharp, jagged, and carried a tone the villagers had not expected to hear from the son of the chief. One moment, he stood tall with a sneer curling his lips, his voice loud as he mocked the girl's silence. The next, his body jolted, and he stumbled forward as though the ground beneath him had betrayed him. His sandal tore against a stone that had not seemed sharp a heartbeat before. Blood welled quickly, bright and red, spilling into the dust. He hissed, clutching at his foot, his face twisting in pain. "What trick is this?" he spat, his voice raw. He tried to lift his weight, but when his soul pressed again to the ground, the jagged edge cut deeper. He howled, a sound that startled even the hyenas lurking beyond the village's edge. The crowd went still for a breath. Their jeers wavered, caught between cruel amusement and uneasy silence. Then, as if to break the tension, one of the tormentors barked out a laugh. "The chief's son cannot even stand upon a pebble. Look, he bleeds from a child's stone." But the laughter died in his throat. For as he mocked, his own body jerked, his balance faltering. He looked down in disbelief. The earth, which had been smooth and steady, now bristled with teeth-like stones. They sliced into his heel as if the ground had grown hungry. He screamed, dropping to his knees, clutching his torn skin as blood darkened the soil. The villagers gasped, some stepping back, others craning forward. Murmurs rippled like wind across a restless plain. "What is happening? Did you see the stone move? The ground itself is angry." Another boy, emboldened moments ago by the chief's son's cruelty, suddenly felt a sharp bite at the arch of his foot. He yelped, hopping in panic, but the stones seemed to rise wherever he landed. They were no longer still objects beneath him. They shifted like living things, pressing against his flesh, slicing deeper with every frantic movement. Panic spread among the tormentors. One tried to run, but the earth betrayed him too. The path that had always been smooth now bristled with edges, cutting him as he fled. His strides grew shorter, blood marking his trail. His cries joined the others, a chorus of agony where only moments before there had been laughter. The girl remained still, her body weak but her gaze unshaken. Her silence was no longer the silence of helplessness. It was the silence of one who waits, of one who knows the earth has taken notice. Her eyes gleamed in the firelight, and though she did not speak, the villagers began to feel as though her spirit was commanding the stones. The chief's son struggled to rise, clutching his wound, his pride as wounded as his flesh. Rage burned in his eyes as he turned on the girl. "Witch," he spat. "This is your doing." He reached to strike her, but as his hand lifted, a sharp stone shot up, slicing through his palm. His cry was louder than before, his fingers trembling, blood dripping into the dust. His companions recoiled. They had never seen the earth act with such defiance. Their courage shrank beneath the weight of something greater than their cruelty. Whispers spread like wildfire among the villagers. The land rejects them. The spirits have awoken. The girl's silence has called the earth. The old women in the crowd exchanged knowing glances, their wrinkled faces grave. One of them clutched her beads tightly and muttered under her breath, "The blood of the innocent awakens the stones. We warned them, the ground never forgets." Still, the tormentors fought against what they could not understand. One picked up a stick and tried to smash the stones beneath his feet, but the wood splintered in his hand as if the earth had hardened itself against his blow. Another tried to leap onto the smoother ground, but the stones shifted, rolling beneath him, toppling him to the dust. His knee struck against a jagged edge and he screamed as the flesh split open. The villagers no longer laughed. Mothers clutched their children closer, fathers shook their heads in silence, and the young ones stared wide-eyed, their games forgotten. The air was heavy, as though the spirits themselves had stepped into the circle, watching, waiting. The tormentors writhed, their cries rising into the night. The chief's son cursed, but his voice faltered beneath the weight of his pain. No command from him could stop the stones, no authority from his bloodline could silence the earth's anger. And through it all the girl did not move. She stood with her head slightly bowed, her silence now carrying the weight of judgment. She did not gloat, she did not laugh. She only endured, and in her endurance the people began to see something greater. Her silence was no longer just defiance. It was the voice of the land itself. And as the tormentors bled upon the stones, the villagers began to whisper a new truth, one that would linger long after the cries faded. The earth does not sleep when innocence is wronged. It remembers. It rises. It punishes. The first cry of pain had been only the beginning. The first cry had been met with nervous laughter. A few men had even clapped one another on the back, insisting that the chief's son was only weak of foot, that he had stepped too heavily on a sharp edge. But when the second scream followed, high and unsteady, the laughter fell away. The air itself seemed to grow tighter, as if sound carried differently now, as though every breath of wind had learned to whisper with suspicion. The crowd of villagers who had gathered at the edge of the clearing leaned forward, their eyes darting from the bleeding tormentors to the ground where the stones shifted and gleamed. Mothers drew children closer to their skirts. Old men tilted their heads as if listening for something that only age could hear. Another boy cursed as he tried to steady himself, but the earth betrayed him. A stone rolled beneath his heel as though it had moved of its own will, and when he stumbled, his palm landed on a jagged shard that split the flesh open. He pulled his hand back, staring at the blood pooling in his palm with wide, frightened eyes. It was then that the first whisper rose. The ancestors, an old woman rasped. Her voice trembled, but it carried like a bell rung at midnight. Others took it up at once, their murmurs weaving together into a low, fearful chant. The ancestors are stirring. The tormentors tried to laugh again, but it was forced now, thin and hollow. Their confidence faltered as they looked down at the ground beneath their feet. Stones they had once kicked aside now looked like watchful eyes, glistening wet with dew or perhaps with something older, something darker. The air vibrated with tension, with the unseen weight of justice pressing down. The girl stood in their midst, her body wounded and weak, but her face was calm. Her blood still seeped into the soil, each drop vanishing as if drunk by the earth itself. Where the blood touched, the ground shifted. Stones quivered faintly, rising like beasts waking from slumber. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence was heavier than any accusation, and the villagers felt it pressing against their hearts. The chief's son tried to steady himself, his pride battling the fear in his chest. "It is nothing," he shouted, though his voice broke. "Sharp stones, that is all." He forced himself to stand tall, but the limp in his step betrayed him, and the villagers saw it. "They bleed, but she does not cry," someone whispered. All eyes turned to the girl. Though her body bore cuts and bruises from their cruelty, she walked forward with measured steps. The stones shifted gently beneath her feet but did not cut her. Where she passed, the earth seemed to soften as if cushioning her path. But for the tormentors who lingered around her, the stones rose like teeth, biting flesh, ripping skin, drawing blood with each step. Fear thickened. A woman covered her mouth with her hand and gasped, "The spirits of justice walk with her." The words ignited something in the crowd. The ancestors have risen. She is chosen. They have turned against the chief's house. The murmurs swelled into a rumble of fear and awe. Men who had jeered before now shifted uneasily, no longer certain of the ground beneath their own feet. The tormentors grew frantic, hopping from stone to stone, but everywhere they landed, pain followed. Their cries echoed through the clearing, sharp and desperate, while the girl's calm footsteps seemed louder than any scream. The chief's son tried once more to speak, but blood dripped from his mouth where he had bitten his tongue in pain. His voice cracked. "She is cursed," he spat, but the words carried no power anymore. The crowd's eyes no longer saw her as cursed, they saw her as marked. And to be marked by the ancestors was not a curse. It was judgment. A boy fell hard onto both knees, shrieking as sharp stones drove deep into his flesh. He begged for help, but none came. Even his friends recoiled from him now, afraid to be caught in the same punishment. The crowd had already begun to shift their allegiance, though not with courage but with fear. A sudden wind swept through the clearing, bending the tall grass and rustling the trees. It carried with it a sound like 1,000 whispers layered upon one another, so faint that no single word could be made out, but so heavy that every villager's skin prickled with dread. The girl lifted her chin into the wind, her eyes half closed as if she could hear what others could not. "She listens," a man breathed. "She listens to the voices we cannot." The tormentors staggered, their arrogance stripped away. They had become clumsy, pitiful figures, bleeding and broken, while the one they had sought to destroy walked with a strange, unshakable calm. She did not raise her hand against them. She did not even speak. The earth itself did her speaking, and the crowd understood. No one dared to move closer. Mothers clutched their children tighter, and fathers pressed their lips to silence. Every villager present knew they were witnessing something that could not be denied, something that would be told and retold long after this day. "The earth judges," an elder finally declared, his voice cutting through the whispers like the crack of a staff against stone. "And she is its vessel." Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Then slowly the girl walked past the last of her tormentors, who now knelt in blood and shame. Her steps were steady, her gaze unyielding. Behind her, the stones fell still once more, as though the earth itself was satisfied. The crowd parted for her without a word. Fear bowed their heads, but it was not only fear, it was reverence. For they had realized the truth. This was no girl to mock, no cursed child to scorn. She was the embodiment of judgment, walking flesh of the ancestors' will, and none could stand against her without being broken. And so the villagers watched in silence, trembling as the tormentors wept. The truth was no longer hidden. It had revealed itself in stone and blood, in whispers of wind and silence of earth. The girl did not need to declare it. The crowd had seen enough, and the legend had already begun. The elders rose slowly, their bodies aged by time but their eyes burning with the weight of generations. For long, they had watched in silence as the youth mocked, dragged, and humiliated the girl. They had seen the people laugh, seen the tormentors boast, and yet they held their peace. But now, as blood poured from the feet of the chief's son and his companions, silence was no longer possible. The oldest among them, a man whose beard was as white as ash and whose staff was carved with the markings of his forefathers, raised his hand. The crowd, restless and buzzing with fear, fell quiet. Even the chief's son, clutching his wounded foot and gasping in pain, dared not speak. "My children," the elder said, his voice hoarse but steady, "do you not see what has happened before your very eyes? The ground has turned against those who shed mockery and cruelty upon the innocent. The very stones have risen in judgment, and this is no small matter. It is not the girl who has brought this punishment but the land itself. And when the land speaks, none may turn away." Another elder, a woman with sun-worn skin and a gaze that could pierce through the thickest lies, stepped forward beside him. She struck the ground lightly with her walking stick and added, "For many seasons we have warned that disrespecting the weak, dishonoring the orphan, or trampling the innocent would bring curses. Yet you laughed at our words thinking them old tales. Now the curse walks among you. Do you not see the blood flowing from the sons of strength while the girl, though wounded, still stands?" A murmur passed through the crowd. Some bowed their heads in shame, others clutched their children close as if to shield them from unseen wrath. The tormentors, still trying to stand, winced and groaned as every attempt to walk was met with sharp agony. It was as though the earth had turned against them, cutting them again and again with each movement. The chief's son spat into the dust, though his face was pale with pain. "It is a trick," he growled though his voice shook. "The stones are sharp for all. The girl is cursed and her curse has spread to us. She has brought this upon the land." The elders turned their stern gaze upon him. The oldest among them raised his staff and pointed it at the boy. "Be silent." You dishonor not only your victim but the ancestors themselves. Did you not drag her before the people? Did you not laugh as her tears fell? Did you not raise your hand against one who could not strike you back? Now you suffer, and you dare to say it is her doing? No, boy, it is your own deeds that have summoned this pain. A hush fell over the village. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, pressing against every chest. The girl stood quietly, her breath calm, her eyes lowered, not in fear but in solemn dignity. It was as though she had already known this moment would come. Another elder spoke, his voice deep as thunder. Hear me, people of this village. This is not the curse of a witch, nor the trick of a girl. This is the land remembering. The ancestors do not sleep when blood is spilled unjustly. They do not turn their backs when the cries of the innocent rise into the night. They see. They hear. And now they answer. Some villagers began to wail softly, rocking back and forth in fear. Others muttered prayers under their breath, invoking the names of long-gone forefathers. The tormentors' families rushed forward to help them, but even those who tried to lift the bleeding young men found themselves trembling, afraid that the curse might spread to their hands. The woman elder raised her voice again. The girl's suffering has awakened the stones. And when the stones awaken, they cannot be silenced until justice is done. Do you not remember the old stories? Do you not recall the tale of the hunter who mocked his crippled brother, only to be pierced by thorns that would not heal until he begged forgiveness? Or the tale of the bridegroom who struck his bride, only to find his own hand withering with every season? These things are not new, they are the ways of the ancestors. And today those ways have come upon us again. The chief, who had remained seated with a troubled face, finally rose. His voice was heavy, laden with both anger and shame. Elders, you speak truth. I did not stop my son when I should have. I thought it was the playfulness of youth. But now the land itself has judged him, and I cannot turn away. Tell us what must be done, that balance may return. The crowd leaned forward in fearful silence, waiting. The oldest elder struck his staff against the earth, the sound echoing like a drumbeat. The tormentors must be punished, he declared. Not with death, for death closes the door too swiftly. No, they must live with their shame. They shall serve the girl they mocked. They shall tend her home, guard her steps, and mend what they have broken. Until the land itself sees their repentance, they will carry their burden. A gasp ran through the people. The chief's son cried out in protest, but his voice cracked under the weight of the elder's decree. The girl lifted her head, her eyes shining with something more powerful than anger, vindication. The woman elder placed her hand on the girl's shoulder. Child, your tears have spoken where your voice could not. Your pain has awakened the stones. You are not cursed, you are chosen. Walk with your head high, for the ancestors have stood with you today. The people bowed their heads. Some wept openly, others fell silent in reverence. And though the tormentors writhed in pain, the judgment of the elders was final. No man could question it. For in that moment the people knew, the girl's suffering had awakened something greater than fear. It had awakened justice itself. The girl lay still as gentle hands lifted her from the place of torment. The stones beneath her no longer pressed into her flesh but seemed to cradle her, as if unwilling to release her too quickly. Women from the village gathered around, their faces etched with sorrow and awe, for they had witnessed something no generation before them had ever seen, the land itself rising to defend a child of innocence. Carefully they carried her away, their steps slow, reverent, as though they bore not just a wounded girl but a vessel of prophecy. Her wounds were many, the marks of cruelty etched across her skin like the writing of pain. But in the hush of that day, when the tormentors were silenced by the judgment of the elders and the stones still hummed faintly with their strange power, her healing began. The elders ordered water to be brought from the sacred well, water believed to carry blessings of renewal. With solemn care they washed her body. Each touch seemed to draw not only the blood but also the weight of sorrow from her frame. She winced at the sting of water against her torn flesh, yet her eyes held no tears. Instead, they carried a fire, steady and unbroken, a quiet proof that though she had been dragged through the dust, her spirit had not been subdued. As days passed, her body mended, though the scars never fully faded. Yet even those scars became symbols rather than stains, marks that told a story deeper than any words could hold. Mothers would later point to them when their daughters asked why the streets were swept with such care, why children were warned never to taunt the innocent, why men were reminded that cruelty against the weak was an offense not just against people, but against the very earth beneath their feet. The tormentors did not escape their fate. The punishment ordered by the elders was harsh, not only to avenge the girl but to set a lesson that would echo for lifetimes. They were made to walk barefoot across the same stones they had dragged her upon. But for them the ground showed no mercy. The pebbles cut deeper, the rocks split skin, and every step became a cry of agony. It was said that the stones remembered the blood of the girl and demanded an equal measure from those who had spilled it. By the end, the tormentors were broken men, and no one who watched ever forgot the justice of that day. From that time forward, the stones of the street were never walked the same way again. Children grew up hearing the tale whispered by the fireside, mothers teaching their little ones to step with respect, and fathers reminding their sons that strength was not measured in cruelty but in mercy. The path where she had been dragged became a place of quiet awe. Travelers slowed their steps there, some removing their sandals, others leaving offerings of food or flowers along the roadside. To dishonor that path was to invite misfortune, for the villagers believed the stones could still stir if injustice ever dared pass their way again. And at the center of it all was the girl. No longer seen as a victim, she became a living reminder of the power that sleeps beneath the soil, a symbol of resilience and justice. Though she carried scars, she also carried a dignity that made even elders bow their heads in her presence. The younger ones would gather around her, eyes wide, waiting to hear her speak. And when she did, her words were not of bitterness but of strength. The earth sees what men try to hide. The earth remembers what men try to forget. Those words became a proverb, repeated in marketplaces, spoken in disputes, and carried into other villages until they spread far beyond the borders of her home. Over the years, her life took on the glow of legend. Songs were composed about her, simple chants that children sang while playing, melodies woven by griots who carried the memory of the event across distant lands. One refrain lingered above all others. They dragged her through the streets but the stones split their feet. In those words was captured the essence of justice, the warning that cruelty turns upon itself, and the promise that innocence is never truly alone. Generations later, even when the girl herself had long passed into the embrace of her ancestors, the story endured. Travelers who had never seen her face still spoke of her as though she were walking beside them. The stones of that street were polished smooth by time and footsteps, yet people still looked upon them with reverence as if expecting them to stir once more. For in every age, injustice threatens to rise, and in every age, people remember that it can be struck down not only by human hands but by forces far older and stronger. Thus, her destiny was not confined to her own life. She became a guardian of memory, a figure half human and half myth, who taught that truth cannot be silenced, that suffering can awaken power, and that the land itself bears witness to every act of cruelty or compassion. In the end, her name was less important than the lesson she left behind. She was called by many titles: the girl of the stones, the child of the earth, the one whose blood woke the ground. But to her people, she was simply the girl who endured, whose story reminded them that justice walks quietly but strikes with unshakable force. And so the tale is told, again and again, around fires, beneath stars and within the walls of homes. Each telling breathes life into her spirit, ensuring she is never forgotten. The streets still echo with her footsteps, not as the sound of a dragged victim but as the rhythm of a legend, one that whispers through the ages. When innocence is wronged, even the stones will rise.